Right. 45 years after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, Cottenham was one of thousands of men working like a slave in these coal mines. Slope 12, you call it.
Slope number 12.
What was slope number 12?
Slope number 12 was a huge mine on the outskirts of Birmingham, part of a maze of mines. Birmingham, it's the fastest growing city in the country. Huge amounts of wealth and investment are pouring into the place. But there's this, again, this need for forced labor. And the very men, the very entrepreneurs who just before the Civil War were experimenting with a kind of industrial slavery, using slaves in factories and foundries, and had begun to realize, hey, this works just as well as slaves out on the farm. The very same men who were doing that in the 1850s come back in the 1870s and begin to reinstitute the same form of slavery. And Green Cottenham is one of the men, one of the many thousands of men who sucked into that process and then lives under these terribly brutalizing circumstances. This place that was filled with disease and malnutrition, and he dies there under terrible, terrible circumstances.
And you found the sunken graves 5 miles from downtown Birmingham.
Just miles away. In fact, there are two places there where, because all of these mines now are abandoned and everything is overgrown, there are almost no signs of human activity, except that if you dig deep into the woods, grown over there, you begin to see, if you get the light just right, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of depressions where these bodies were buried.
You say that Atlanta, where you live, which used to proclaim itself the finest city in the South, was built on the broken backs of re-enslaved black men.
That's right. When I started off writing the book, I began to realize the degree to which that this form of enslavement had metastasized across the South, and that Atlanta was one of many places where the economy that created the modern city was one that relied very significantly on this form of coerced labor, and some of the most prominent families and individuals in the creation of the modern Atlanta, their fortunes originated from the use of this practice. And the most dramatic example of that was a brick factory on the outskirts of town that at the turn of the century was producing hundreds of thousands of bricks every day. The city of Atlanta bought millions and millions of those bricks. The factory was operated entirely with forced workers and almost 100% black forced workers. There were even times that on Sunday afternoons, a kind of old-fashioned slave auction would happen, where a white man who controlled black workers would go out to Chattahoochee Brick and horse trade with the guards at Chattahoochee Brick, trading one man for another or two men.
And yet slavery was illegal.
It had been illegal for 40 years. But, and this is a really important thing to me, I was stunned when I realized that because the city of Atlanta bought these millions and millions of bricks, well, those are the bricks that paved the downtown streets of Atlanta, and those bricks are still there. And so these are the bricks that we stand on.
Didn't this economic machine built upon forced labor, didn't these black codes, as you call it, the way the black life was criminalized, didn't this put African Americans at a terrific economic disadvantage then and now?
Absolutely. I mean, the result of those laws and the result of, and particularly enforcing them with such brutality through this forced labor system, the result of that was that African Americans, thousands and thousands of them worked for years and years of their lives with no compensation whatsoever, no ability to end up buying property and enjoying the mechanisms of accumulating wealth in the way that white Americans did. This was a part of denying black Americans access to education, denying black Americans access to basic infrastructure like paved roads, the sorts of things that made it possible for white farmers to become successful. And so, yes, this whole regime of the black codes, the way that they were enforced, the physical intimidation and racial violence that went on, all of these were facets of the same coin that made it incredibly less likely that African Americans would emerge out of poverty in the way that millions of white Americans did at the same time.
How is it, you and I are both Southerners, haven't met you until now, how is it we could grow up right after this era and be so unaware of what had just happened to our part of the country?
Well, I think there are a lot of explanations for that. The biggest one is simply that this is a history that we haven't wanted to know as a country. We've engaged in a kind of collective amnesia about this, particularly about the severity of it. And the official history of this time, the conventional history, tended to minimize the severity of the things that were done again and again and again, and to focus instead on the idea, on a lot of false mythologies, like this idea that freed slaves after emancipation became lawless and sort of went wild, and thievery and all sorts of crimes being committed by African Americans right after the Civil War and during Reconstruction. Well, when you go back, as I did, and look at the arrest records from that period of time, there's just no foundation for that. And the reality was there was hardly any crime at all. And huge numbers of people were being arrested on these specious charges so they could be forced back into labor.
Another reason is, I just think as you talk, another reason is that anybody who raised these allegations or charges or wrote about them when I was growing up were dismissed as communist. You know, if they'd been from the Wall Street Journal, it might have been a different take.
Well, I think there's some truth to that. Anyone who tried to raise these sorts of questions was at risk of complete excoriation among other white Southerners. But that's also what's remarkable about the present moment. And one of the things I've discovered in the course of talking about the book with people is that there's an openness to a conversation about these things that I think didn't exist even 10 or 15 years ago.
What has been the response to it?
Well,
Americans don't like to confront these pictures, these stories.
They don't. But over and over and over again, I've encountered people who've read the book, who email me, or they come up to me after I talk about it somewhere, particularly African Americans, who African Americans know this story in their hearts. They may not know the facts. They may not know exactly what the scale of things were, but they know in their hearts that this is what happened. And so people come up to me and say, gosh, the story that my grandmother used to tell before she died 20 years ago, I never believed it, because she would describe that she was still a slave in Georgia after World War II or just before, and it never made sense to me, and now it does.
It is amazing that this was happening at a time when many of the African Americans retiring today were children.
Were children, exactly, exactly. And so, again, these are events, unlike antebellum slavery, these are things that connect directly to the lives and the shape and pattern and structure of our society today.
Does it explain to you why there might be so much anger in the black community among, let's say, African Americans who are my age, 73, 74, who were children at the time this was still going on?
Well, there's no way that anybody can read this book and come away still wondering why there is a sort of fundamental cultural suspicion among African Americans of the judicial system, for instance. I mean, that suspicion is incredibly well-founded. The judicial system, the law enforcement system of the South, became primarily an instrument of coercing people into labor and intimidating blacks away from their civil rights. That was its primary purpose, not the punishment of lawbreakers. And so, yes, these events build an unavoidable and irrefutable case for the kind of anger that still percolates among many, many African Americans today.
If people want to know more about not only your book, but about all of this, research and so forth, where do they go?
Go to my website, or the book's website, www.slaverybyanothername.com.
Douglas Blackmon, thank you for being with me.
Thanks for having me.
Find out when you can watch Traces of the Trade. Log on at pbs.org. This episode of Bill Moyers' Journal is available on DVD or VHS for $29.95. To order, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.
Trusted, in-depth, independent. This is PBS.